A quick summary. In the first Currie lecture, we compared the current cultural moment to historic periods of moral awakening in this country. I then suggested that we're in the midst of a season that can be helpfully, heuristically described as the Great Awokening. Noting numerous parallels between then and now, we observed that this moment in time differs in one key way from earlier calls for repentance and ethical renewal. The First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening arose out of Christian worship services. Those movements were rooted in spiritual and theological convictions. Today, churches face a curious predicament. The ethical conversation often begins out there in the culture. Now, to some, this is evidence that these conversations are political, code for, I don't want to discuss this stuff in church. To others, this cultural moment represents an indictment of the contemporary church. Why, they ask, are we so late to the ethical party? Questions like this are infused with an extra spoonful of urgency given the rapid pace at which contemporary ethical conversations fly across social media platforms. While preachers have always needed to weigh when and how to address complex, hot-button moral issues in the pulpit, Bible in one hand, newspaper in the other, today's listeners come expecting thoughtful, relevant theological responses to emerging issues, some of which, I swear, started trending that Sunday morning. The title of today's lecture is Challenge. It refers to three distinctive challenges that this moment presents to contemporary churches and contemporary clergy. I want to begin by considering a broad challenge presented by our cultural context. When it comes to the most pressing moral conversations of the day, what does it mean for contemporary churches to be seen as late to the party by some in the pews and an uninvited guest by other aspects of our society? With that accomplished, we will pivot to consider the challenge presented by contemporary assaults on truth, and the challenge that comes from trying to talk about anything in a world brimming over with righteous anger. Morality minus faith. One of the hallmarks of this moment, this great awakening, is the fact that the majority of the voices raising moral questions in our society do not make appeal to religious principles, theological tradition, or any sort of divine being. Yes, there are exceptions, and we'll consider some of these in lecture number 3. Nonetheless, while many churches and clergy actively and regularly seek to bring theological resources into conversation with the complicated ethical issues of the day, this decentered moment is not particularly interested in incorporating religious input. This past summer, I heard echoes of this in a fascinating comment made by Mike Griffin, an African-American organizer in Minneapolis. Griffin was being interviewed in regard to the protests following the killing of George Floyd, and he made clear that these protests were not rooted in religious communities. Instead, Griffin argued, they were bubbling up in an organic way. They were happening, I quote, without the black pastor coming in and telling us how to do it, unquote. Having grown up idolizing the role played by black clergy and black churches in leading the civil rights movement, I heard Mr. Griffin's comment as a sea change. Many who are leading, and I really should say organizing, the Great Awokening are not especially interested in input from the church. Post-Protestantism. New York Times columnist and conservative-leaning Roman Catholic Ross Douthat is not surprised. Douthat argues that we have entered a post-Protestant era in America. In a nutshell, Douthat's argument goes like this. Once upon a time, in the 1950s and earlier, mainline, predominantly white Protestant churches were the primary mediators of this country's moral conversations. The pastors of the local Lutheran, Presbyterian, Methodist, and Episcopal parishes were good-natured rivals who traded members on occasion and who upheld middle-class American values. This influence carried over into the political realm, where the Supreme Court of this country was dominated by white male justices hailing from mainline Protestant churches. When there was a hot topic to be debated by society, questions regarding the regulation of alcohol, the limits of religious liberty, or who ought to be allowed to have sex with whom, mainline Protestant voices led the way. Catholic, Jewish, Mormon, and fundamentalist colleagues were viewed with suspicion and rarely allowed to join the conversation. African American and Latinx churches were treated as potential allies with specialized agendas, or they were ignored. Now, Douthat acknowledges that this description of mid-20th century America is a cliche that deserves much more careful unpacking. Douthat, however, paints with a broad brush so as to make a quick turn to consider two major outcomes resulting from mainline Protestantism's sojourn in the sun. Result number one. Douthat argues that mainline Protestantism, in dominating moral conversations for a good bit of the 20th century, infused public discourse, the writing of laws, and the way in which ethical conversations take place with mainline theology and spirituality. Behind the moral opinions being offered and then legislated and ruled upon in the courts were the spiritual practices and theological beliefs of mainline Christians. God, or at least the God attested to by this subset of American believers, was in the mix. Result number two. In setting themselves up as society's moral arbiters, Douthat argues that mainline churches sowed the seeds of their own disintegration. When mainline churches and mainline denominations could not come to an agreement on a thorny ethical issue, they divided. In fight after fight over women's ordination, over racial equality, over human sexuality, mainline Protestant churches began to split, and its denominations began to hemorrhage members. As this happened, mainline Protestantism began to lose influence over the cultural and political institutions it had once dominated. Quick question. How many Protestants sit on the Supreme Court today? Answer? Well, it all depends on whether you count Justice Neil Gorsuch as an Episcopalian or a Catholic. In any case, the answer is one or none. Over the years, Douthat argues, evangelical groups have made bids to pick up the mantle that fell from mainline Protestantism's shoulders, but they were never quite able to pull it off. They failed, Douthat suggests, because they were never able to win enough converts to hold the moral attention of younger Americans and to make common cause with African American and Latinx churches. All of this means, Douthat argues, that a void exists at the heart of our public discourse. In every corner of American life, we are engaged in highly charged moral conversations organized by people who suspect that these conversations are best served by not inviting input from religious communities who might, God forbid, want to bring God into the conversation. In a nutshell, mainline moral sensibility has outlived mainline metaphysics. While Douthit argues that political moderates and liberals now operate largely disconnected from communities of belief and the practices of the faith, others point out that this same dynamic is occurring on the right. In 2016, during the Republican primary campaign, Donald Trump split the evangelical vote with Ted Cruz and Ben Carson. If you drill into those numbers, however, you will discover something fascinating. Cruz and Carson won a large percentage of evangelicals who said that they attended church every week. Trump won a different slice of evangelicals, a slice, according to the Pew Foundation, of the American religious pie that's actually growing. Trump won with evangelicals who say that they seldom or never attend church. When I first heard this, I literally gasped. Growing up, the kids I knew who identified as evangelical were in church all the time. This expectation was coded into the label. To be an evangelical was to be grounded in and forever seeking out religious community, whether that be in a church or a camp or a college Bible study. I found it difficult to wrap my head around the concept of an unchurched evangelical. And yet, the Pew Foundation has recorded clear drops in church participation across all flavors of American Protestantism. And this means that for some Americans, evangelical is becoming more a cultural label than an indication of specific theological priorities or faith commitment. Now, what does that mean? Well, in many ways, I think the jury is still out. Although I do think it's safe to say that on both the left and the right, moral discourse is increasingly being conducted by people who have not been shaped by religious communities. And this shift is having an impact on the character of our civic discourse. Peter Beinart, writing for The Atlantic magazine, points out a startling trend. For years, the conventional wisdom has been that as church attendance declines, the old culture wars will fade away. Once we get over church, we'll arrive at a new ethic of toleration. According to Beinart, the exact opposite is proving true. When polled, those who do not participate in a religious community are those, regardless of political affiliation, who turn out to be the most scared, most angry, and most likely to blame others for the nation's woes. Secularization, says Beinart, isn't easing political conflict. It's making American politics even more convulsive and zero-sum. What does this mean for a nation engaged in numerous complicated ethical conversations? Well, Douthit predicts that without a spiritual underpinning, the zealous moralism of the Great Awokening will burn hot, burn bright, and soon burn out. He may be right. Although I would point out that the zealous moralism of the Great Awakenings also subsided, and those movements did have clear spiritual underpinnings. So what do I think is going to happen? And what role will churches play? I've got a lot of fog in my crystal ball. Still, I think Protestant churches have an important, if decentered, role to play in relation to contemporary ethical debates. We'll spend time considering this possibility in lecture number 3. I want to use the remainder of our time today addressing 2 other intertwined dynamics that present challenges to congregations and clergy in contemporary culture. The first has to do with the erosion of public standards for truth, and the second, a related issue, addresses the role that anger plays in public discourse. Intertwined Challenges. 3 years ago this week, the RAND Corporation, a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank dedicated to delivering fact-based solutions to government policymakers, issued a report entitled Truth Decay. This book-length document addresses the diminished role facts and rigorous analysis play in American public life. In speaking about the report, Michael Rich, the president of the RAND Corporation, remarked, "This is, to me, a really dangerous and unusual time in history, because Americans not only feel entitled to their own opinions, and rightly so, but many of them, a growing number of them, frankly, across the political spectrum, also feel entitled to cherry-pick facts to support their opinion, or even commission up new facts if necessary. When everyone has their own facts, then nobody really has any facts at all." According to the Truth Decay report, our inability to agree on individual facts or broader truths in this country is contributing to the erosion of civil discourse, the growth of political paralysis, and the alienation of individuals from political and civic institutions. They should have added religious institutions to that list. Cultural battles over truth present an enormous challenge to contemporary churches and the diverse communities that call them home. As long as I've been preaching, I've had parishioners and visitors pre-pandemic slip me envelopes on the way out the door after worship. "This," they would sometimes whisper, "is the truth." Inside the envelope, I would find an article about the Second Amendment or the State of Israel or Black Lives Matter from their favorite op-ed writer. I've enjoyed these almost clandestine exchanges. Often the enclosed clipping was meant as a corrective to something I'd said the previous week, but sometimes they were intended as an encouragement, and many times these articles simply identified an issue that this person thought was important. I liked receiving these envelopes. I liked seeing what people were reading. I liked considering new perspectives. I figured the whole thing was a fair trade. They'd listen to me preach. Why shouldn't I listen to something they wanted to share? Recently, though, in emails and letters, the gentleness of the clipping exchange has been replaced by a more anxious set of concerns. One email described feeling personally attacked when a preacher offered a critical assessment of a public figure this parishioner admired. Another questioned whether the church even cared about the truth. How can the church possibly address thorny moral topics when public standards for what is true have so radically diverged? How can communities talk if individuals have predetermined that their perspective is the only true one and all else is false? Gia Tolentino. One of the contemporary voices I find especially helpful in sorting through questions related to truth and church belongs to Gia Tolentino, staff writer at The New Yorker. Sidebar, Tolentino, like Andrew Sullivan, is difficult to pigeonhole. The child of Philippine immigrants, Tolentino grew up as a millennial in Houston, Texas. Throughout her childhood, she was very active in a nearby Southern Baptist megachurch. Reflecting on this experience, Tolentino describes the church of her childhood in a nuanced way. She speaks of the lasting lessons it taught, both good and bad, worth keeping and worth rejecting. Tolentino's essay, Losing Religion and Finding Ecstasy in Houston, which appeared in the May issue of the New Yorker magazine in 2019, is one of the most amazing and truly unsettling articles I've ever read on religion. In this essay, Tolentino describes the experiences that led her to leave her family church and walk away from institutional religion. She does this without bitterness, calmly asserting that Christianity informed my deepest instincts. And then, continuing to peel the layers of the onion, Tolentino describes how, over the last decade, she has repeatedly used drugs like ecstasy and other substances like alcohol to try and replicate the feelings of rapturous transcendence that she sometimes felt in worship as a child. If all this sounds weird, chaotic, and dangerous, you're in the same place I was on first encountering Tolentino's writing. Yet I return again and again to see what she has to say. Tolentino's shocking honesty and quicksilver prose provide the most rigorous, compassionate, and clear-eyed insight into American millennials and their often ambivalent views on religion that I've found anywhere. One final biographical comment. On one level, Tolentino seems to be a perfect example of what Douthit describes. She's a liberal who soaked up the Christian ethos, and yet she's now abandoned Christian community and exhibits no confidence in the existence of the Christian God. She pursues ethical arguments with conviction shaped by faith, but without faith itself. And this is precisely the sort of flame that Douthit suspects will soon burn out. He may be right, although I have a different takeaway. I've actually been guided by and take hope from Tolentino's perspective. How so? Well, first off, Tolentino recognizes the complicated way in which religious truths enter and inform our culture. In one essay, she describes being drawn to rap music because, and I quote, its sound entangled sin and salvation, unquote. Second, Tolentino is the sort of writer who can offer a wilting critique of the hypocrisy and sheer wackiness of the contemporary church, while simultaneously making a case for the transcendent based on the spirituality of Julian of Norwich. Shout out to Jones lecturer Carol Howard Merritt. All this is to say, I've come to see Tolentino's writing not as a harbinger signaling the end of the Protestant church, but as a sort of loving challenge to contemporary American Christianity. As Jesus said, those with ears to hear, listen. Sidebar over. Truth and reality. In her book, Trick Mirror, Reflections on Self-Delusion, Tolentino describes how, as a 10-year-old, she was fascinated by the internet. She spent her time online visiting sites about Beanie Babies, those small collectible stuffed animals, and chatting with other kids about their collections. Tolentino describes the early days of the internet as being sort of sweet. People would patiently explain to each other there how to behave. Don't use all caps, it's shouting. Tolentino was captivated by the internet's ability to connect people. She charts the growth of the internet from this somewhat geeky place where people would gather around shared interests to a place with dark corners where misogynist trolls, conspiracy theorists, and white nationalists also can find like-minded conversation partners. From a place where people engaged in a sort of garage sale commerce, buying and selling their personal stuff, to a place where people began to spend an enormous amount of time building and curating their identity. A place where knowing an individual's preferences and likes became the ultimate monetized clickbait prize. This, Tolentino explains, is why everyone tries to look so hot and well-traveled on Instagram. This is why everyone seems so smug and triumphant on Facebook. This is why on Twitter, making a righteous political statement has come to seem, for many people, like a political good in itself. People choose to signal their virtue on social media platforms, Tolentino continues, because they feel more and more powerless to bring about change in their everyday lives. The endless stream of thumbs up and hearts and other encouraging emojis give you the feeling that you're making a difference. Virtual feedback makes it all so intoxicating. It makes it feel like you're accomplishing something. The other intoxicating and utterly addicting thing the internet has done, Tolentino argues, is it has become incredibly adept at telling each of us exactly what we want to hear. As the founder of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, once remarked, social media is organized around the notion that a thing is important insofar as it is important to you. Using algorithms, these platforms are forever figuring out what you care about and then delivering more of it to you. What does this all-you-can-eat buffet of like-minded information do to us? Here, Tolentino makes a startling and disquieting claim. Facebook's goal of showing people only what they were interested in seeing resulted within a decade in the effective end of shared civic reality. Is that true? We no longer share the same civic reality. I remember vividly the Sandy Hook elementary school massacre that took place 8 years ago this past December. I remember weeping in my office as the awful news trickled in, an attack that claimed the lives of 26 people, many of them small children. I remember working with my alma mater, Yale Divinity School, to raise money for a dedicated chaplain who could be on call for the families affected by this unspeakable tragedy. In the aftermath of Sandy Hook, there was so much pain. And there was also something else running through our society, something unholy. An internet editor by the name of Alex Jones, who ran a website called InfoWars, a site visited regularly by millions of people, began to suggest that the shooting was a hoax. It never happened, said Jones. Parents faked the death certificates of their kids. I was furious when these reports began to surface. I knew the chaplains who sat alongside these families. How could anyone call Sandy Hook a hoax? The comments aired on InfoWars added a cruel twist to already unfathomable pain. The truly shocking thing, though, was that the stories proliferated. There were copycats. Soon, hundreds of online posts began asserting that the Sandy Hook massacre never happened. Some even claimed that the parents were trying to profit off the fake deaths of their children. Now, I don't want to give the original authors of those posts any more airtime. Their purposes were evil. But I do want us to consider why so many other people forwarded and reposted this content. In this, Tolentino's words haunt me. if we no longer share the same reality, if the truths we consume, that we are fed, only and always confirm what we already believe, moral discourse seems doomed. Is the kind of ethical conversation that diverse congregations hope to model to the world even possible? The Sandy Hook deniers are an extreme example of the distance people can put between themselves and reality, all to preserve a specific narrative about who and what represents the biggest danger in our society. And still, other controversial issues manifest similar hallmarks. Our biggest arguments make clear that we live in different realities. Anger and truth. In September of 2017, CNN conducted a town hall to talk about protests that were occurring during the singing of the national anthem before National Football League games. Anderson Cooper moderated. The panel included a former player, a retired Green Beret soldier, a pastor, and filmmaker Spike Lee. As they began to talk, a question began to emerge. Was kneeling during the national anthem a legitimate form of protest against unequal treatment and violence against African Americans in this society, and a critical way to raise issues for broader public conversation and scrutiny? Or was kneeling during the national anthem a sign of disrespect for our country's flag, and the women and men in uniform who had fought for our country, sacrificed for our country, died for our country? Spike Lee and NFL player Malcolm Jenkins argued that kneeling was a legitimate and historically significant form of protest. Others on the panel spoke about the goals of the protest, and some suggested alternative ways to protest, tweaks to the current protest. Others asserted that it was possible to both honor the country and its soldiers and offer a heartfelt protest of racial disparities. Then, after a break, Anderson Cooper invited a couple of guests to stand up in the audience, Vincent and Diana Bonacasa. Cooper told viewers that the couple had recently lost their son, Staff Sergeant Louis Michael Bonacasa. He was killed by a suicide bomber while on duty in Afghanistan. Then Mr. Bonacasa spoke. He said, "Last Sunday, we attended a ceremony for Gold Star parents. It was a humbling ceremony that left us with an empty feeling. Then we came home, turned on the TV, and there was the NFL players on their knees. That was a slap in the face to us." Spike Lee immediately offered his sympathy for the couple's loss. He spoke of honoring the troops while also lifting up the historical constitutional right to protest in America. Lee continued, "The narrative that when NFL players take a knee, it's insulting your son who's no longer here is not true." I could imagine off-screen producers rubbing their hands with glee. This was good TV. It was clear that this was the moment the network wanted, the clash of two very different, highly conflicted, and passionately held truths. Pain rose from my television screen in waves. I felt empathy for the Gold Star family. I felt empathy for Spike Lee, and I felt anger at CNN and at all the forces who see the collision of different people's realities as entertainment, as clickbait, as opportunities to build their brand and monetize their viewers. Again and again, the Great Awokening offers us examples in which competing versions of truth are pitted against each other, evoking righteous anger and compelling people to double down on their version of the truth. Elements of our culture actually enjoy, profit from, and gain power from this in aiming competing truths at each other and harvesting the righteous anger that results. This takes us to today's short story. A reminder, I promised to end each of these lectures by considering a bit of short fiction. Sort by Controversial by Scott Alexander. One of the most provocative pieces of fiction I've read in recent years comes from the long-form blog of a West Coast psychiatrist and rationalist who goes by the pseudonym Scott Alexander. Alexander's story, Sort by Controversial, is a fascinating and chilling tale. You can find it on Alexander's blog, Slate Star Codex, and I commend this story to you. The narrative unfolds as the personal account, you might even say diary, of a fellow who works as a programmer at a Silicon Valley startup. And this small marketing company is developing an algorithm that can identify the kind of statements that will get the most positive clicks, the most thumbs up, the most forwarded links. Now, obviously, this would make for quite a prize. Knowing precisely what types of statements will make you feel happy, excited, and most importantly, eager to buy a product is every marketing team's dream. In the story, the team experiences success with their algorithm. Then one day, while experimenting with its possible uses, they flip the program on its head. Basically, they task their computer with analyzing boatloads of online content and generating statements that will be maximally controversial. When the computer eventually spits out its list of the top 100 most controversial statements, the main character looks at it and assumes that the new algorithm has failed. He reads a few of the statements and laughs. You don't seem controversial at all. Every statement on the list looks to be either one, obviously true, or two, clearly wrong and disturbingly so. Disappointed, he walks into a coworker's office to show the failed results to his colleague. And that's when our narrator realizes not only has the algorithm succeeded, but dangerously so. Reading one of the statements out loud to his coworker, he's surprised when they immediately begin to argue with him. How can this be? The statements are either unambiguously true or demonstrably false. Still, the disagreement between the two co-workers quickly turns acrimonious. It sucks in other people from the company too. Before long, everyone is arguing. Just one of the statements generated by the algorithm tears the startup apart. People get fired, lawsuits are brought, everything falls to pieces. Later, in reading over the list, the narrator begins to identify statements that look familiar. Some of the computer scenarios mirror situations that have already caused controversy in the wider culture. For example, the 42nd most controversial statement on the list reads like this: an African-American sports star who kneels during the national anthem intending to protest police violence is actually an affront to the nation's dignity and a rejection of the sacrifices of its men and women in uniform, true or false. At this point, the main character realizes that his team hasn't developed a marketing tool, but a weapon. Their algorithm generates statements that, when dropped into a news feed or an internet chat room or an everyday conversation, make people hate each other. They've taught their computer to generate statements that can slice human community into ribbons. The coders name their program the Scissor. Scissor statements and the church. One of the greatest challenges the Great Awakening presents to the church and to the wider world is the diabolical way in which our sense of what is true and what is real has been weaponized. It's been weaponized by foreign governments who sponsor troll farms, who spend every day pumping toxic scissor statements into social media feeds. It's been weaponized by each of us, if we're honest, in pursuit of righteous causes. In one of her essays, Tolentino describes in an eloquent and heartwarming manner the solidarity she witnessed on the street during the 2017 Women's March. A march which took place on January 21st in cities all over the world. Now, even though there'd been a few kerfuffles behind the scenes in regard to who was in charge and who would be invited to speak and what agendas would be publicly acknowledged, the actual event brought millions of diverse people with very different agendas to the streets in a peaceful, almost carnival-like atmosphere. It was a remarkably unified movement for 2 months. In April of 2017, a millennial columnist for the New York Times, Barry Weiss, wrote a piece accusing the organizers of one of the women's marches in Chicago of being anti-Semitic for banning Star of David flags. In a follow-up column, Weiss argued that progressives, like conservatives, were unable to process their inner hate. These columns became a real-life scissor. Within hours, social media posts and rebuttal essays were flying back and forth. Leaders of the Women's March began to argue the group behind a march that had manifested for a moment such remarkable solidarity was consumed by accusations of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, Zionism, and fascism. Weiss eventually resigned from the Times, citing unrelenting online bullying for her views and tribal prejudice on the paper's editorial board. Some said good riddance, blaming Weiss for instigating the whole destructive clash. This, my friends, is the same volatile world the contemporary church inhabits. We who gather in Christian community are those who have also allowed truth to be curated for us in countless ways, and especially by social media. We participate in systems and technologies that feed and support views of reality that conflict with our neighbors. We hold these views with righteous fervor, and we will angrily defend these truths when they come under attack. In other words, we have become incredibly vulnerable to scissor statements, to carefully crafted arguments that identify malevolent thoughts and heretics in our midst, ideas and people who ought to be banished. In the Great Awakening, a great many folk from a surprising variety of backgrounds and religious movements are poised to shame and exile others. Folk are itching to use words that sound a lot like Theodorus Frelinghuysen's sermon from the first Great Awakening. The period of grace is concluded. All earthly satisfaction ceaseth. Your agonies and pains as to soul and body have no end, for ye shall be cast into that lake which burns with fire and brimstone. Today, we considered 3 challenges to Christian communities seeking to find their voice in the contemporary world. Challenge 1, we live in a post-Protestant context. Challenge 2, truth is under siege. And challenge 3, we are wielding righteous anger as a scissor. How should the church address these 3 challenges as it seeks to be about the mission of Jesus Christ in the world? We will turn our hearts and minds to that question tomorrow in lecture number 3.